What is external world skepticism, and why should we care about it? Well, let's start with the skepticism part. To be a skeptic about some realm of knowledge, right, some realm where people usually think that we know, is either to claim that we actually don't know anything in that realm, or even stronger, that we can't know anything in that realm. Right, so the skeptic is usually seen as somebody who denies a certain body of knowledge, or who claims that it's even impossible to have that kind of knowledge. So an external world skeptic is somebody who takes a skeptical attitude towards knowledge about the external world. Now, when philosophers talk about the external world, they think about like the kinds of physical objects that we see around us, and in fact even the kind of physical object that maybe in some sense we ourselves are, right? So even my own body would be part of the external world. Typically, we can think of the external world as consisting of all those objects that we can perceive and that we can act upon using, physical bodily action. So, for instance, a good example of an object in the external world is my Nietzsche bust. Right? I can perceive it, for instance, by looking at it, and I can act on it, right? I can wave it around so that everybody watching this video is going to see my beautiful Nietzsche bust. Alright, so the world of external objects is the external world, and it contains human bodies and Nietzsche busts and trees and houses and stars and maybe atoms and all those kinds of things, or at least that's what we're usually saying. Now, clearly it is possible, and in fact it often happens, that we have doubts about the existence of some particular object in the external world. Right? We may wonder whether the Loch Ness monster really exists. I have very strong doubts about that. You might wonder whether my Nietzsche bust really exists. With all that generative AI stuff nowadays, maybe I don't really own a Nietzsche bust and I just faked a video where I seemed to be holding a Nietzsche bust. It's possible. It's not true. There's a real Nietzsche bust here, but it's possible. There are even instances where we seem to perceive something and we actually don't, right? Maybe there's some kind of hallucination going on, for instance. I think I see a Nietzsche bust, but actually I'm only hallucinating a Nietzsche bust. So it's completely possible to have doubts about the existence of any particular object in the external world. Now, what is special about external world skeptics is that they entertain doubts about all the objects in the external world. They entertain doubts about the very existence of the external world itself. Right? And so a skeptic about the external world could be somebody who says that we don't know whether there is an external world, or even stronger, somebody who says that we can't know whether there is an external world. Now, one point that I want to make very clear is that when I talk about knowledge here, so when the skeptic says, well, we don't know whether there's an external world, I don't mean something like absolute certainty or infallibility. So most philosophers nowadays don't think that knowledge requires infallibility or, the kinds of absolute certainty that means that you can't be wrong. So most philosophers nowadays, if you come to them and you say, hey, you might be wrong about the existence of this Nietzsche bust, they would say, yeah, I might be wrong, but that's extremely far-fetched. I still know that there's a Nietzsche bust. Right? So if the only thing that the skeptic did was to say, look, you might be wrong about the existence of the external world, then at least some philosophers would be happy to say, I might always be wrong. I still know that it exists, though. Now, the skeptic doesn't need that move, right? The skeptic is not somebody who has to insist on infallibility as a criterion for knowledge. The skeptic is somebody who says, look, even if knowledge does not require infallibility, you still don't know that there's an external world, right? You still don't know there's an external world because you don't have any good reasons for believing that there is an external world. And here, of course, different external world skeptics could come up with different arguments, but usually the argument for external world skepticism goes something like this. The skeptic points out that the situation where there is really an external world and some other situation where there is no external world are indistinguishable. And with indistinguishable, I mean that the person who's in those two situations can't find out which of the two situations they're in. And so familiar examples are things like Descartes' evil demon, right? There might be an evil demon who manipulates me in such a way that I am conscious of all these objects that actually don't really exist. Or the popular updated version of the evil demon is the evil neuroscientist, right? Maybe I'm a brain in a vat and I'm being manipulated in such a way that all these objects that I think exist, like Nietzsche busts and trees and so on, that's just my neurons being manipulated. They're not really there, right? That would seem to be possible, maybe. It would certainly seem to be indistinguishable from the good situation in which there is a real world, right? So in the real world, I'm seeing all these things, but as a brain in a vat or as a victim of an evil demon, I seem to be seeing these same things, right? And there's no way for me to find out which of the two situations I'm in. And so what external world skepticism then claims is basically that, well, if I can't distinguish between those two situations, then I can't really claim that I know to be in one situation rather than another, and therefore it can't be the case that I know that there's an external world and that there are really trees and houses and Nietzsche busts and human bodies. So something like that is usually the kind of argument that an external world skeptic gives us. Now, there are different ways to reply to that, but in this video I want to think about the following. I want to think about the fact that the mere fact that we can't tell the difference between two scenarios is not enough to make us interested in the kind of skepticism that this generates. That may sound like an abstract claim. I'm going to give you a concrete example. So suppose that somebody comes to me and this person tells me, look, maybe the entire universe was created by God 1 second ago. I say, well, look, I have lived for many years, right? How could the universe have been created 1 second ago? And they say, no, but God created it in such a way that it seems like the universe is billions of years old, including, God gave you all these memories which never happened, and so on and so forth. So by design, of course, this scenario is indistinguishable from the one where the world has a billion-year-old history. Okay, so it's clearly true, I would say, that I cannot, given these two scenarios, right, the world really is billions of years old or the world was created 1 second ago, I can't tell the difference, right? That's how the second scenario has been designed. I can't tell the difference. But philosophers have not, for the most part, been very interested in this 1 second ago skepticism, right? They've not been sort of pulling out their hair thinking, oh no, how do we prove that the world is older than 1 second? Right? I haven't really seen that happen. There's not like books and books and books full of people reflecting on how to deal with this type of skepticism. And in fact, once we think a little bit further, it turns out that different forms of skepticism are very cheap. It's very simple to generate a new form of skepticism. So, for instance, what do you think about Australia skepticism? Right? I have never been to Australia. I haven't seen it with my own eyes. So what if people come to me and say, hey, look, maybe everyone in the world is in one big conspiracy to convince you that Australia exists, but it doesn't. And I'm like, look, come on. I've seen Australia on all these maps. I've talked to people who have been in Australia. I have heard stories about Australia. I've seen movies that were set in Australia, and they say, yeah, that's all part of the conspiracy. You know, by design, this scenario is one where I can't tell the difference between it and the, I hope, real world, where there is no Australia conspiracy of people bent on making me believe in a non-existing continent. I can't tell the difference. And yet, you know, I am not going to worry about, maybe Australia doesn't exist. I'm not going to sort of feel the need as a philosopher to reply to Australia skepticism. So it's easy to generate forms of skepticism by thinking up these indistinguishable scenarios where I, as a subject, can't tell the difference between the good scenario and the bad scenario where I am being deceived. And usually, we don't take them seriously in philosophy. And so I think it is a very real question why philosophers take external world skepticism seriously and why they think that we need a reply to it. And there is an answer to that. And the answer to that is that external world skepticism seems relevant because it pops up as a serious problem from a particular and very influential way of thinking about experience. And this way of thinking about experience was popularized, at least in the Western philosophical tradition, by René Descartes, who is also the person who popularized external world skepticism. This is absolutely not a coincidence. So here is the way that René Descartes tells us that experience works. So when I look at this Nietzsche bust, what is going on? Well, Descartes says, what I am aware of is not the Nietzsche bust, right? I'm not aware of this physical object. What I am aware of is an idea in my mind, right? I'm aware of an idea in my mind. And that idea in my mind, I suppose, has been caused by this Nietzsche bust. But that's not what I'm aware of, right? I'm not aware of the Nietzsche bust. I'm not aware of the causing. I'm aware of the idea in my mind. And so I need something, right? I need something to get from the awareness of the idea in my mind to a belief about the external world, to a belief that there really is a Nietzsche bust out there that is causing this idea in my mind. Right? So what we have here is a story about experience, about sense perception, where what I experience is not the things in reality in the external world. What I experience are things in my mind. And if that's the right story about experience, well, then philosophy itself generates this question of how do I then know that these experiences are caused by an external world? Right? And if philosophy itself, in trying to reason through how thinking works, generates this question, well, then it's a question that we have to take seriously and that we have to try to answer. Right? This is a question that rises up in reason itself. When we try to understand our own knowledge, this is a question that comes up and it seems extremely important and pertinent, and we need to answer it. And of course, the question of 1 second ago skepticism, let alone the question of Australia skepticism, doesn't pop up, right? It's not the case that in reasoning about human knowledge, I suddenly realize that there's something fundamentally problematic about my knowledge of Australia. No, but I do realize, if I believe in this Cartesian conception of experience, I do realize that there is something fundamentally problematic about my epistemic relation to the external world, right? Because experience never goes there. Experience doesn't go to the external world. Experience stops inside my mind. Experience stops with the idea in the mind. How do I bridge the gap between the idea in the mind and the external world? That is where external world skepticism comes in, right? External world skepticism is what you end up having if you think that there's no good story to tell here. And so philosophers like Descartes, and of course many others in the tradition, have tried to tell a good story about how to bridge this gap. Okay. So, how do you get out of external world skepticism? Because let me tell you, most people don't think that external world skepticism is where you want to be. One thing you could do is bridge the gap. This turns out to be fairly difficult, but people have tried. The other thing you could do is reject this conception of experience. And for my money, that's what you ought to do. For my money, what you ought to do is you ought absolutely to deny that when you're looking at this Nietzsche bust, what you're experiencing is an idea in your mind. You're experiencing a Nietzsche bust. You have a relation to this object, right? That's the story about experience that I think you should be telling. And if that's the right story about experience to tell, then external world skepticism starts to look just as quaint, as optional, and as irrelevant to philosophical reasoning as 1 second ago skepticism and Australia skepticism. And I think that that's a pretty desirable thing to happen.